Nancy Maria Garr was sister to Phyllis's great-grandfather Abel. Nancy Garr was the second children in the family of 11. Her parents were Fielding Garr and Pauline Turner. At the age of 17, she became the oldest child in the family as her older sister Eliza married. At 22, she was left without a mother and assumed the role to the younger four children. She thus learned to know what work was and how to get along with and manage the family. In 1845, on March 9th, in Hancock County, Illinois, she married Rodney Badger, a young man of her own age from New England. In 1846, a daughter was born to them, which they named Nancy Maria. These were trying times of persecution, privation, and preparation for the westward pilgrimage. Rodney was called to go with Brigham Young's company to prepare the way to build roads, bridges, and go ahead to Utah. This left Nancy with her year-old baby daughter, Nancy Maria, behind to come as best they could with her father, Fielding Garr, and his other children. After their arrival in Salt Lake City, 3 other children were born to them. They were Rodney, George, and Charlotte. They had been married 8 years when Rodney, her husband, was drowned. Nancy was brokenhearted, so much so that she was sick for a very, very long time. She now took her family and went to live with her father, Fielding Garr, on Antelope Island, where they stayed for nearly 3 years, or until her father died. While some of the sons were driving cattle along with the church herds to Cache Valley, where they continued their ranching and pioneering activities, at least one son remained behind to assist the daughters of Fielding Garr to settle for the winter. Sarah Ann Garr stayed with Nancy, her widowed sister, in her home in the Badger City lot. The others, Caroline, Mary Virginia, and youthful Benjamin, settled in a 3-room adobe home their father had built on the lot next door. Thereafter, one of the older sons remained with the sisters until their eventual marriage, with the absence of their father, Fielding Garr, to his death. In 1858, when Nancy was 35 years old, she married Bryant Stringham and again went to Antelope or Church Island to live. Her children now ranged from 6 to 12 years. To this marriage was born 2 daughters, Sarah Jane and Mary Emma. This union lasted over 12 years when Nancy became a widow again at the death of Bryant Stringham at the old church farm on Mill Creek. Her first marriage had lasted 8 years, and she was about 23 when she was first married, and she was 77 at her death. She had been married but 20 years and had lived a widow for 34 years. Nancy was the 4th wife of Bryant Stringham. He was married to 3 of the Nathaniel Ashby's daughters. When Nathaniel Ashby died, his wife Susan, with 11 children, needed help to cross the plains, and Bryant Stringham was there to help them the entire trip. After a couple years after arriving in the Salt Lake Valley, Bryant married Susan Ashby, who was recently divorced. A year later, Susan's mother passed away. Bryant and Susan took in many of the younger siblings to care for. A year after that, Bryant married Susan's sister Harriet, who was single, and 4 years later he married Susan's widowed sister, Martha. In July of 1871, Bryant Stringham was caught on the Great Salt Lake during a storm and was soaked and exposed to a chilling wind. He became ill, developing congestion of the lungs, and from which he never recovered. He died August 4th, 1871. He left 4 widows and 27 children, all under the age of 21. Nancy's oldest son, Rodney Carlos Badger, had become somewhat educated and was a good bookkeeper. He had worked in Salt Lake City. Rodney, who had married Harriet Ann Taylor, daughter of President John Taylor, was left in Salt Lake, living in the home of his father who had been drowned. This home stood for many years, 1 block east and 1 block south of the present Union Pacific Depot. Rodney was to pay rent to his mother for its use. Now, George Badger, his younger brother, had very little schooling, wanted to go with his sister Maria and her husband, William Holden Ashby, to Holden, Utah, and he did that in 1872. He secured a lot there, built a log house in it for himself and his mother, and in November he went back to Salt Lake and returned with his mother, Nancy, and his 3 unmarried sisters, Charlotte, Jane, and Emma. In November 1875, George Badger married Miranda Stevens. He needed the entire house, so Nancy moved to the rock house of John Evans on the block east of her daughter, Jane and Peter Stevenson. She did this in 1889. In 1886, Charlotte married William Ashby, and Emma married George Stevens in 1889. So all of the sisters were now married. It was in 1883 that someone of the folks was sick and needed an appetite pampered. Grandmother had some nice young chickens in an old-fashioned porn crib. She climbed on a rickety box, trying to get one to appease the notion, when the box broke and she fell, dislocating her shoulder. She was devout and attended meetings. She loved children, and no sacrifice was too great for her grandchildren. She lived with her daughter Charlotte during her latter years of her life. Nancy suffered a dislocated shoulder in 1883, and after 17 years with her shoulder and being bedfast for 5 months, grandmother died and was buried in Holden, Utah, April 1900, at the age of 77.